Hello friends, my name is Marines and this is a 531 prediction video. Basically in these videos, I pick a book that I think I will rate 5 stars, one that I will rate 3 stars, and one that I will rate 1 star, and I read them and tell you how close I was to my prediction. I've done this once before and I thought it was interesting as a reply to people who ask me why I read things that I suspect I won't like. I won't give you the whole spiel again in terms of like how I decide what to read, what I read, but really the entire point of this is that you never know what you're going to get in a book until you read it. For my 1 star prediction, I have When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. Why am I going to read it if I don't think that I will like it? Here's the thing is that I don't think I will like it because I'm being very pessimistic about this as like another romantasy entry. But the thing is that I have heard really wonderful things about this book, even from reviewers whose tastes overlap with mine. I'm just a really hard sell these days on romantasy, so I'm expecting very little to nothing going into this, but I'm going to give it a chance because of its popularity and because of how highly I've heard people talk about this book. My 3-star prediction is An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. I've not read anything from Henderson before, but this is another one that I have heard people talk really highly about. I am curious about the hype. I'm curious to give Henderson a shot, but also I'm not entirely sure that this will be for me. I'm a little bit more confident that it might be competent and not for me, which is why I slotted it into the 3 stars. And my 5-star prediction is Metal from Heaven by Clarke. I know very little about the premise of this book, but I do know that like multiple people in my Discord have read it and absolutely loved it. There's a lot of gushing going on right now in my Discord for this book, so I have really high hopes. Okay, wish me luck. We've got a change in scenery. As you guys can see, I am in Kansas City visiting my best friend, Nicole. I have read the first 2 books for this project, and I kept meaning to like stop and review each of them right after I finished, but I did a lot of binge reading over the weekend in the lead up to this trip, and between like Thanksgiving and the family stuff and like getting ready for the trip and the travel day, I just never found a time to do the review. But we're here now, we're settled in, so let's do it. My 5-star prediction was Metal from Heaven by Clarke. It is a challenge to describe this book. I will give you, I guess, the high level plot thing, but I'm not sure that that necessarily fully captures what this book is. It is an adult fantasy, and we follow our main character, Marnie Honeycutt, and she is a sole survivor of a massacre that happens during a labor strike. When she runs away from there, she falls in with a band of famous highwaymen, and we see her growing up within this group, hell-bent on revenge against the factory's owner. To that end, she gets an opportunity to disguise herself as an aristocrat, to infiltrate high society and win the heart of the factory owner's daughter. That is the nuts and bolts of it, but I don't think that really gives a sense of how you felt the story taking these like twists and turns, how it really felt like the portrait of a life in a way, because we were following just Marnie through these different stages. And I think that like each stage of her life kind of felt very distinctive within the story, to the point where it didn't feel like a traditional sort of story arc. We just kept like doing these things. It's like time to do this now, and not necessarily in a bad way, but in a way that did feel like I was reading something that was different from what I usually read. Clarke in the story kept making very interesting choices, right? There wasn't a time that I felt that she was doing anything with her characters or with her plot or with her world that felt expected or felt easy. And because of that, and I think because of the writing style, it was a story that I felt demanded a lot of my attention. I definitely started and had to like restart and go back and be like, no. One, because I was not immersed and I was not understanding. I was like, no, this is like something that like takes that investment of attention. And 2 is because I started it on audiobook, and the audiobook narrator's performance is good. It is solid, but there were like little quirks about the performance. Like for instance, there were mispronounced words, and I couldn't tell if this was on purpose or if it was just the narrator getting words wrong. I don't know. It feels like such a like silly thing to complain about, and people mispronounce words, but it was a thing that was like jarring enough that would take me out of the story. And this is a story that doesn't have room for that. It doesn't have a lot of room for you to be like pulled out because you will miss things. There is a density to the prose itself, and it's not necessarily like in language or the inaccessibility of the language, but there's something about the cadence of it and the approach to information that makes it feel dense. And it is descriptive, and again, in a very sort of like non-traditional way. And I kept going back and forth on what this means for me and my experience of this book, because I definitely felt impressed by the project. I can talk about it very highly from the perspective of like appreciating the thing that Clarke was doing, all of the explorations of the themes, the world that she built, and what she ultimately says about like rebellion and revolution, and like how we challenge people in power and the power of like revenge to carry someone through their life, but also how that speaks to ultimately the power of love in this story, and how that was a thing that truly Marnie was holding on to with like a closed fist, was love for the people that she lost. So all of that I could tell was very well done. So the thing that I keep waffling about is how much like the writing and the style keeps you at arm's length from the story itself, right? And how far removed my investment in the story is from like my appreciation of the craft of the story, and the lines between where I was like, oh, this just needs a little bit more attention, and where I'm like, no, this actually isn't doing a great job at communicating clearly. I think especially in action scenes, there was a way that Clarke, in describing action or in taking us through the beats of a scene, sometimes got lost in the action, so that I as the reader had to go back and go, wait, hold on, I'm not actually tracking like movement to movement in what is going on, because a lot of times like that movement felt so lost in the things that were surrounding it, which even though that stuff that was surrounding it was well told, that still means that you're losing the reader and like the thread, the narrative thread that is supposed to be propelling them forward. So navigating exactly where one thing ends and the other thing starts, and like that appreciation versus the critique, was really tricky for me. This is also one that I think that I would like to reread, now having in my head like the full shape of the story and the kinds of characters that we're encountering. I feel like this could be a story that I appreciate even more with time and with a reread. I really liked Marnie. I appreciated all of the characters that we met for all of the like shades of complication and nuance that they had to themselves. Like there was such a like lovely breadth of characters that we met. I think this was also rather brutal. There's so much violence that Marnie experiences in her life, and the story doesn't shy away from showing you that. And I think it goes a long way in also like crafting Marnie as a character, because you really start to see the way that this violence has shaped who she is as a person. I've seen this compared multiple times to The Locked Tomb, which I think is interesting. I understand why, especially because you have like a lot of similarities in terms of like these queer characters in a very violent and brutal world. I will say that to me, The Locked Tomb is more complicated in its plot and in the way that it is purposefully withholding information and like feeding it to you slowly, and it is purposefully keeping you in the dark about what is exactly going on, and it does so by rooting you in the point of view, the limited point of view of the narrators. But the language I think is very accessible in The Locked Tomb. For all of the times that I was confused in The Locked Tomb, it wasn't because I was reading the words and not fully processing or understanding the words. It was because I only had so much information, me and the narrator, and so like you're meant to be puzzling these things out. Whereas I think Meadow from Heaven, the plot itself is not that complicated at all. And I think that once you understand like the shape of the world, that isn't very complicated. The magic is interesting in terms of like having Marnie have this magic that she is also ultimately allergic to. She spends so much of this book like literally like doing great feats of magic and then having like a deeply allergic reaction to her own magic, which I thought was really interesting. But the part of it that I think sort of like muddies its own meaning in its own story is the language and is like the feeding and the telling of the story. So that is what I think is like the main difference. And I think that difference does sort of change the tone of both of these stories. While they are both brutal and while there is like violence in each of them, I did find more of a levity to the Locked Tomb than I found in Metal from Heaven, which I think if you are a fan of Locked Tomb is something that you should know from Metal from Heaven. That is not to say that I disagree with the comp. Again, there are a lot of similarities, but that is the major difference that I found. All of that said, and now I have to settle on a star rating. I don't know. I think that I am at a 4-star currently. I think that that could easily be bumped to 4.5 stars as this sits in my feelings and as I like have time to process it. But I think right now it is a 4-star. With my 4-star ratings, these are books that I have more positive than negative to say about. Like I might have 1 or 2 main cons for the book, but mostly it is positive. And they are books that I would recommend, but sometimes like not universally. And this is a book that I'm not sure I would recommend universally. And I think more that is with the book in mind. Like this is a book that deserves to find the right audience that really will appreciate like the unconventional story, the unconventional approach to storytelling, the really rich language, the way that the cadence of the writing is used to create that sense that you are reading something that is special and a little bit different. So yes, I think I'm settling on 4 stars, and I definitely would read more from this author. I would reread this book, and I think I'm going to be thinking about this book for a long time to come. My 3-star prediction was An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. This is an adult fantasy. It could probably be classified as a new adult fantasy. It is about a young woman named Lennon Carter, who at the beginning of this book is invited to attend a mysterious college, like under very mysterious circumstances, and sort of out of the blue, she is told that she is being sort of interviewed to attend this college. And even though the circumstances are very unusual, Lennon is at a point in her life that she wants to start over. And so she decides to go along with it, only to find that this is a magical school for people who are talented in the art of persuasion. As she spends time here and finds herself really wanting to succeed and to belong in the school, she also starts to uncover like the price of attending the school and the dark secrets that prop up this school, as she also contends with what it means to have this kind of power. I was really into the beginning of this book. I think the hook is like very strong. From seeing Lennon at where she exists at the beginning of this book, sort of as a stay-at-home girlfriend, and seeing that change very quickly and understanding like why she would be like, this is strange, this call from a school I never applied to is strange, but why she would go with it, I don't know. All of that really worked for me. Seeing Lennon arrive to the school and start to meet the students, like it had the elements of like what I like in these sorts of magical school settings. And so I had like really high hopes for it at the beginning, but the longer that it went on, the more I think it squandered both the strength of the hook and like all of the pieces that it had for the characters and the setting and like the thematic content, what it was trying to explore. I think we started really strong, and then Henderson went on to do like the opposite of what I described in Metal from Heaven, and that is take the most like trite and easiest sort of paths into everything she was exploring. This is why I tend to have such a hard time with dark academia books. In theory, they always sound so interesting, the vibe and the aesthetic, right? But I want it always to be more than vibe and aesthetic, which I know is like where it started, but like there is so much to explore when you're talking about academic settings and the idea of academia and the power structures of all of it. And Henderson starts there and starts having her main character ask all of these really valid questions about like the things that they are learning to do and whether or not they have a right to do them just because they can. And then we end up at like a professor-student relationship, and she is an adult. She's 24, I think, in the book, so it is not like a problematic sort of age thing, but that is not the only reason. An age gap is not the only reason, or an age difference, that like student-teacher relationships are bad. It is absolutely a power imbalance thing. And this is a story that by putting these two characters together highlighted what that power imbalance was in a way that made me very uncomfortable. And that got worse and worse for me as the story went on, because the story continued to rely way too much on the withholding of information. That made sense in the beginning when we walked into the situation as readers with our character and as we were discovering the school and the magic along with her. But once that discovery portion of the story was over, then it just kind of switched to people not telling our character things and her sort of just like asking questions but never getting answers, and that being the main thing that like was taking us to the end. And that's the kind of thing that starts to wear on me. I think you have to be really skilled in order to like parse out information and answers to your reader, so it doesn't feel like we're just kind of spinning in place with these kinds of stories where our character is in the dark. That's the work of any good mystery or anything with a good mystery core, is knowing how to feed out that information in a really satisfying way. And I don't think this did. I think that this held back too much, and too much of it was like, I'll tell you later. There was like moments where it was like literally like, we'll talk about that later. And once you get to the point where characters are just sort of saying to each other, oh, I can't tell you right now, we'll talk about that later, you know you haven't done a great job understanding how to feed that information out in a way that feels seamless, that feels graceful. So here was like not super loving how repetitive it was getting, how much it was relying on the withholding of information, and not enjoying the romantic relationship that it was setting up. And then we get to the last sort of quarter of it, and things happen. Things take a turn that change this to me like actively being angry at this. Like I won't say that I hated this, but it got to a point that I really I was mad by the choices that Henderson made. And I don't tend to love those kinds of stories where it feels like I'm 10 steps ahead of the main character. I don't mind when there are things that I know that the character hasn't learned yet, but when it feels like things are too obvious and I'm too far ahead of the main character, then that gap creates an unpleasant reading experience. So like the swing was wild for me, from like really being into it at the beginning to like how sharply I fell off with the story, and how much I felt like Henderson squandered like a lot of the potential that she had to make the most uninteresting choices to put together these two characters in this relationship, in this situation. It ended on such a sour note for me. I think that I would give this like a 2 out of 5 stars. It feels in my emotions like a generous 2, but I know that there is like some competence here in terms of the writing and the craft, so I don't know, 2 stars. In the way that Metal from Heaven feels like it could get stronger in my feelings, and Academy for Liars feels like it could get worse in my feelings. But that's where we are now. Speaking of where we are, that means I have one book left for this project, which is my 1-star review, which was When the Moon Hatched. I really said, why not give myself a 700-page book to read for this project? Now, here's the thing. I'm about 150 pages into that. I was reading during my travel day yesterday, so I got that chunk of it done. But this is a video that if I want to keep up with Vlogmas, this is my 3rd video of the month that has to go up at like some point today. I've been late with these. I've been posting them at like 1 o'clock in the morning, but even so, I have like 550 pages left to read. If I want to get this up, it's some approximation of today. And I was like looking through my video ideas of like, is there anything else I can sub in? But this one's almost done. So I'm gonna go now and like buckle down and try to get as much into When the Moon Hatched as I can. And I say that, and that's probably kind of a spoiler to how I'm feeling about this book already. It was my 1-star prediction for a reason, and it's already feeling like it could go down that path. I won't say too much before it's time to actually review this, but we'll see. I think that there is a chance that at some point I just DNF this because it is so lengthy and I feel like I have a vibe for what is happening already. But I guess you guys will find out the next time you see me how far I get and if I finish this book. I finally finished reading When the Moon Hatched, and this video is coming a day later than I wanted it to, mostly because like I kept going back and forth on whether or not I wanted to DNF. I was literally sitting and listening with my best friend. She was like putting together a desk, and I kept like taking off my headphones and going, it's not that bad about the story. And I put them back on and keep listening, keep reading, and I'd be like, oh no, actually this is pretty bad. And I kept flip-flopping so much that at some point I was like, I'm not going to try and rush this. I actually want to get to the end, and I want to put together my thoughts of like where exactly this succeeded and where it failed, especially because the strongest part of the story was the beginning, at the point where I'm like, oh no, like I think I'm enjoying this more than I expected, especially from the negative reviews that I had heard. But it hits a point in the plot where everything that it took like a lot of pain to set up at the beginning of the story, like a lot of words to set up, it just sort of abandons for a bunch of what feel like side quests, and like not in a fun way. Side quests derogatory. And so it kept like ambling and just adding on and on more world and adding on more characters, adding on points of view, adding on like all of these different things that the story started to feel too weighed down under the heft of everything that this author was feeding you. I think it's really interesting to think about that in the context of the number of people that I have seen who do enjoy this, enjoy it in the like context of other romantasy, right? A lot of people who are reading a lot in this subgenre, I've seen them talk about this book positively as like, this is what we want romantasy to be. And I find that interesting because I kind of get it. I think that a thing that this book does that is sort of sorely lacking in a lot of romantasy is care about its fantastical elements. My like favorite complaint to make about the subgenre is that it's not doing fantasy well and it's not doing romance well either. And I think that specifically the reason that it's so difficult, I mean, I think that there are a couple of reasons why this subgenre doesn't work for me particularly, or like what is very popular is like stuff that I'm not vibing with. I think a lot of the things that we have seen being the most successful in this genre and a lot of the things that everything else is emulating is stuff I don't like, right? So like the Sarah J. Maas School of Writing Romantasy is very much informing this subgenre, and I hate those books for a lot of different reasons. But like the other side of that is that idea of like not being very strong at either fantasy or romance, because in a lot of ways those two genres take different skills and their stories sort of focus on different areas. So I understand why in this book specifically it feels like it is taking more care with its fantastical elements than a lot of romantasy does. I think that too many times in these romantasy stories what we are seeing is that like the romance is really the thing that it wants to do, and the fantasy elements feel like these flimsy props that are holding, it's like whatever, world, hand wave, something about dragons, right? But enemies to lovers, and like that's the thing that it really wants to do. Where in this story, I think that this author really cared about the fantasy world. I think that she thought so much about this world. I think that she had a better understanding of like all of the minutia of this world than like most authors. I think she went too far on the other end though, because I feel like this is a thing, this is like a real skill in writing fantasy specifically, is understanding what all your world is and understanding the backstory and the lore and all of that. That's great, but you also need to know where the confines of your story are, what makes sense to include, what the reader needs, and when to feed that information. And this book did not have a strong grasp on any of that. I think it told us too much. I think it included information we didn't need, especially not in the confines of this book. And it didn't feel like effective setup anyways. It just felt like we kept like being dangled and like left off on the edge of cliffs. And so like maybe in another book we will get follow-up But when you have too many threads this way that feel open or that feel pointless, or you introduce too many things, then you're like, I don't know, hindering the story you are telling. It all can't be set up for future things. That understanding of the shape of your story, when to start and stop it, is a real skill. And unfortunately, I feel like this book was totally missing that, and it really undoes a lot of the care that you can tell the author had, or like the interest in her own world, when everything just starts to feel a little superfluous. That all said, there were still like certain moments that to me stood out and were interesting, and like different little elements that I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I kept having these like few and far between moments where I was like, wait, that is actually cool. And so it made, I think, the reading experience more frustrating, because then it would be like all of this like side quest stuff, or all of these like random asides or whatnot. A lot of ways that we were just sort of like spinning in place, and then it would be like a moment where I was like, oh, well, that was cool. Had it not had those moments, it probably would have been easier to DNF, but I kept being kind of pulled back into the story in a way that only made it all the more frustrating. There are like a number of like little things that I think will live strongly in my memory. There are these little pieces of enchanted parchment, which is how they like send letters. There was one that she kept like a little pet almost at the beginning of the story. It was super cute, especially as we kind of meet her at this as this like badass assassin disconnected from her feelings, or so she claims. She's like swaggering around and saying a bunch of stuff about how she can't feel and she doesn't have family, but then she locks herself in her room and she's got this little parchment pet, and it was just a cute moment. Yes, it does come back around at the very end of the book, but like I don't know, it becomes another thing that kind of gets abandoned by the story. But like the idea of this parchment pet, this enchanted parchment that like sends messages, super cute. Some of the elements of the dragons in this world were interesting. There wasn't enough dragons to me, but the lore, the idea that when dragons die, they float into the sky and solidify and become the moons of this world, really interesting, especially when you consider that sometimes these moons crash and it creates a whole like geological problem for this land. And so like, again, pieces of the world building, some of the creatures, some of the world, super interesting. Those moments, unfortunately, didn't happen frequently enough, especially when I like think about, for instance, maybe summarizing this plot for you or explaining the lore, the gods, the religion, or anything like that. I don't know that I could do so in a cohesive way. It was a completely overwhelming amount of information. I think the real thing here is that I feel almost a little bit sad for this book and this author, because I think it was it was self-published at first, but then it was acquired and traditionally published. And from what I could tell, looking just like page counts or whatnot, there was some editing that happened, but I don't think enough. And that is really sad to me, because this feels like a book and a premise and a world that has incredible potential, or that had incredible potential had it been edited well. Had someone sat with her and like gone through developmental editing and really fixed the parameters of like what this story needed to be, what the next stories will be, which parts of the world the reader needed to have, and specifically at this particular moment. And I feel the same exact way about the writing. I think that you will probably find people that think that this was really beautiful writing, and there was language and there were moments that stood out to me as vivid and that painted a good picture of either like the scenery, the emotions, or whatever was happening on page. But again, those moments were few and far between, when most of what we were getting was just so incredibly verbose. Every sentence to me felt like a clown car in terms of being absolutely packed with description. And it wasn't just like the amount of description, because if it was just a lot of description, but it was done well, that would be one problem. But so many times when this author was using 5 words when one would do, she did a lot of like, instead of saying he smiled, it would be like the corners of his mouth quirked up. In that sort of realm of using too many words, you also start to lose meaning. And a lot of times she used a word that was like a thesaurus word that was similar, but not quite what she meant anyway. So that also starts to confuse meaning. And so there were moments that I just felt like suffocated under like the sheer amount of words and the way that a lot of times they just felt a little off. There's one thing in particular that the author did so much of that like most of the times that I thought about just like DNFing and walking away is because I read a passage where she was doing this one particular thing. The main character is this assassin, and she's very hardened, and she's got a secret like past life, right? And we learn pretty quickly, like you connect the dots pretty quickly, that like one of the point of view characters and another is probably the same person. The main character is sort of avoiding that truth, and she has all of the pieces that we have, but it is something that she rejects. She doesn't look too closely at her own emotions or her own past, and that is the way that the author like talks about this in the story is that our main character has an internal lake. And this is the way that she describes emotions. She's always like, oh, I felt a thing, but I went into my internal lake and I stood at the shores of my internal lake and I threw this emotion into the bottom of my internal lake. And then it got so convoluted, right? Because you start at, I went to my internal lake and I threw the emotion, but like the more you use it, the more you have to iterate on that. So it's like the icy shards and the light under the surface of my internal lake by the time that we got to the end. And I swear to God, every time this internal lake showed up, I just was like, why am I doing this? I regret everything. It was 718 pages. And I never regretted my choice to continue reading as much as I did when that internal lake showed up. And I think that goes hand in hand with like this idea of the language and being like allergic to saying what you mean, right? Instead of saying your heart, it was like a pounding organ. And instead of saying I felt sad, she was like, I was at the shore of my internal lake. I absolutely had war flashbacks to reading 50 Shades of Grey. Never since the inner goddess have I hated someone's internal anything as much. I mentioned at the beginning of this rant how I feel like a lot of the more popular and prominent examples of romantasy that we're getting right now kind of come from the Sarah J. Maas School of romantasy writing, and this book absolutely does. This book is kissing the ass of Sarah J. Maas in so many ways. Some of the writing style I think is there. I think that is a more subtle thing, just in like overt like word choice or whatnot, a way that this author also forces tone through ellipses. She does the Rebecca Yarros thing of word period, word period, word period to add emphasis. And there were a lot of things like that she used to add emphasis that to me feels a lot like Sarah J. Maas's writing, right? So the abuse of punctuation, repetition, there was a lot. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the TikTok of the guy who he does like actors repeating a line to add emphasis. So it would be like, you're my sister. You're my sister. That's all I could think about when I was reading like the repetition of lines that she did, and it felt like in a story that was already 718 pages and absolutely way too wordy and was giving us way too much of the world, like that, not trusting the reader to like understand like the weight of moments and the weight of language. I don't know, we didn't necessarily need that emphasis to understand the importance of the things that were being communicated, but she did it anyways. The character archetypes was a big one as well. This main male character is very Rhys-and coded. I will say, I liked this guy better than Rhys. It's not a very high bar to clear. I feel like most characters can trip over that bar because I hate that guy. There were ways that I thought that this guy just like treated the female character better, but he is very, very much Rhys-and coded. And his whole like entourage, his family, the land that he lords over, whatnot, all of those things had so many like one-to-one comparisons to things that I have read in Sarah J. Maas's work. I think the lingering thing I'm left with is disappointment. That is like all the more acute because the beginning is the strongest part and it just kind of rambles on from there. There were so many things that I was left like, but what about all of the stuff? It has a very abrupt shift, I think, from like the beginning of the story, setting up the kind of stakes that you would expect in a high fantasy, laying out the revenge and the lost memories and rebels, and she's an assassin and evil kings. So really high stakes, political stakes that you get. And then we abruptly shift into this place where it's just the main female and male characters like together, and it becomes very personal stakes of like them in close proximity and like you know, her all of like flip of a switch feeling sexually attracted to him. And then we just kind of do that for a while. Like the number of times that she's like, I'm running away to go do revenge, and then she doesn't go anywhere. It just is like, girl, please, like I'm begging you to run away and go do revenge. But she didn't, because we needed to do the personal stakes, where I feel like a stronger edit would have more seamlessly integrated both of those things. Overall, I don't know, I think that I had brief moments of enjoyment. There were things here that I think had potential. The only way that I would read a second book, I mean, I don't know, I say this, I would always do something for content, but just like apart from content, only inspired by like my own motivation, I would read a second book if it were like 400 pages or less. But the idea of spending another like 700, 800, 900 pages with the story and with this author, like I couldn't do it. All of that said, like 2 stars? I think it is a 2-star. I don't know if it will sour in my memory. My 5-star prediction, I gave 4 stars. My 3-star prediction, I gave 2 stars, and my 1-star prediction, I gave 2 stars. I think that is very, very similar to the first round when I did this video, so not quite a pattern yet, but the next time I do this, we'll see what happens. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I mentioned in this video, let's chat down in the comments. I did technically miss one day of Vlogmas already, but it's good. We're fine. I feel like I just bit off a little more. Like I didn't really think about the fact that one of the books that I gave myself homework to read was 700 pages. But it's fine. As always, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed my content, if you want to support my work, you can follow the link in the description to my bindery. It takes 15 seconds to follow me there. It is completely free and it goes a really long way to supporting me. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Fantasy stakes, now a timeout to let these two be horny for each other, and then the end. I was like, I'm a little confused and definitely unsatisfied.